In the late 1800s, America is going to start to expand beyond the continental United States. And one of the reasons for this expansion is the idea of manifest destiny. And the idea of manifest destiny came about in the 1840s in the United States. And basically what this meant was that the United States was destined from God to expand west. And now that the west part of the United States had been conquered, the question came about, where else could the country expand to now that all of the continental United States had been conquered? And so what that's going to do is the United States is going to start to look at places beyond North America to expand. At this time, other nations, specifically European nations, had begun what is called imperialism. And what imperialism is when other nations go into less economically sound, less powerful nations and take over. So, for example, the British, the French, Belgians, Dutch, Spanish, and Germans all had gone into areas of Asia and Africa and created colonies where they exploited them economically. So they took advantage of the natural resources, goods and services that these nations had. And one of the reasons that these European nations did this was because they claimed racial superiority because they were white and because they felt that they were more sophisticated than the nations in Asia and Africa. So if we move forward here, the United States is a little late in the game to imperialism. And we don't start to expand until the mid to late 1800s. And one of the first areas that the United States is going to expand to is what's modern-day Alaska. So in 1867, the U.S. Secretary of State, William Seward, he is going to purchase Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. So why exactly would Alaska be an important asset to the United States? Well, if you look at the map, you could see Alaska is very close to Russia. By purchasing Alaska, we're preventing Russian expansion into North America, which is something the United States was nervous about at the time. They wanted to keep as many foreign powers out of North America as much as possible so that they could continue to have control. Alaska also positions the United States so that we could easily have access to Russia and access to other points in Asia. And not to mention, which they didn't know at the time, was Alaska also has many natural resources that we still use today. Another nation that we are going to take power or take over is Samoa. So in 1878, the Samoans are going to sign a treaty with the United States, which is going to grant us a U.S. Navy base at Pago Pago. So why would we want to have a Navy base here? Well, Samoa is pretty much smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This would give us an advantage if we did have to go to war with any Asian nations. We wouldn't have to go all the ways from mainland California to Asia. This is really the halfway point in the middle of the Pacific. So it gives us an advantage to protect ourselves if any countries are headed towards the United States. And it also gives us the advantage of we don't have as much distance to cover if we need to go fight more towards Asia. Now, Hawaii today, we know it as a state, but it wasn't always a part of the United States. It was its own country at one point. So back in the 1800s, Hawaii was its own nation, and it was really well known for the sugar plantations. So in 1875, Hawaii is going to sign a trade agreement that is going to allow sugar to enter the United States duty-free, so that's without a tax, in exchange for a promise that none of the island would be leased or used by a third power. So what that means is that only U.S. sugar companies would be able to use the land in Hawaii. No other nations would come in. And what this is going to do is it's going to lead to a huge sugar boom. Production of sugar is going to increase tremendously. And these U.S. companies that have formed these sugar plantations there are going to need workers. And Hawaii is going to see an increase of Chinese immigrants coming to the Hawaiian Islands for work. So many come to the islands that there actually is this huge influx of Chinese living in Hawaii. And it starts to worry the native Hawaiians because they're starting to be the minority in their own country. So because Hawaiians are starting to get a little nervous on what's happening with the Chinese immigrants and the American businesses, they want to try to restrict the political power of Americans in Hawaii. And Hawaii had a queen at the time, and she's going to try to restrict the power of white American planters. And she's not successful. The planters are actually so powerful that they get the help of the United States Marines to help overthrow the queen. And when this happens, these business owners, they're going to request the United States government to annex Hawaii, which means that they're pretty much preparing Hawaii to become a state. So in the year 1893, the president at the time is Benjamin Harrison. And he is going to agree to put together an annex treaty before he leaves office. He's leaving office. He doesn't really care that much. He's kind of leaving the problem for the next guy that's going to be President Grover Cleveland. So President Grover Cleveland, before he makes a decision on if he's going to annex Hawaii or not, he wants to make a very informed decision. So he's going to send a commissioner to Hawaii to find out exactly if the U.S. citizens had acted properly or not in taking over the nation, and also to discuss if Hawaiians actually want to be annexed into the United States. And his commissioner is going to find that most Hawaiians do not support annexation. They want to continue to be their own nation. President Cleveland even tries to restore the power to the Queen of Hawaii. But the white planters in Hawaii, the white American planters, are so powerful that they form their own government. And they're going to create the Republic of Hawaii. So the Republic of Hawaii is very short-lived. By 1898, the United States decides to annex Hawaii, and it eventually becomes a state in the 1900s after World War II. The one event that's really going to get the United States involved, though, in imperialism and in foreign relations is the Spanish-American War. And at the time, Spain owned the country of Cuba. Cuba was actually one of Spain's oldest colonies. The issue was the United States traded more with Cuba than Spain actually did. The U.S. had a lot of businesses there. There were a lot of sugar and mining companies in Cuba that were American-owned. The Cubans are going to revolt against the Spanish rule several times in the 1800s, and they were continually unsuccessful at this. In 1895 to 1898, Cuban rebels are going to start a war, though, in Cuba. It's a Cuban war for independence. And this is when they're going to look to the United States to help them get their freedom from Spain. Many people in the United States wanted to stay out of this war, but there was many that wanted to get involved. And one of the ways that they went about trying to get others involved was this new type of journalism that had formed. It was called yellow journalism. And there was two newspapers in particular that were very highly involved in this yellow journalism. William Randolph Hearst, he owned the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer, he owned the New York World. Both newspapers at the time were trying to gain as many readers as possible and sell as many newspapers as possible. And a lot of times, the journalism that they would report would be exaggerated, made up. So, for example, Hearst claimed newspapers should not just report the news, they should form public opinion and change legislation. So they should give people ideas on how the government should be or how the world should be. And many reporters at the time that were in Cuba reporting would exaggerate and make up stories to attract readers for both newspapers. So what ends up happening is the U.S. does get involved with what's happening in Cuba. On April 6, 1896, the U.S. Senate endorses granting official recognition to the Cuban rebels. So we're recognizing that the Cuban rebels are fighting for their freedom. And by doing that, we're showing on paper that we're supporting them. Even though the U.S. Senate does this, the following year, President William McKinley becomes president, and he continues a policy of neutrality. He does not want to take sides. What happens the same year, Spain offers the Cubans self-government without independence. Basically, Spain says to the Cubans, you guys can form your own government, but we're still going to own you. And the Cuban rebels, they want their complete freedom from Spain. One of the events that is going to really lead to the Spanish-American War is the USS Battleship Maine. So the USS Battleship Maine is going to be docked in Havana, Cuba. They were there on a courtesy call. And this is going to be in January 1898. I'm sorry, I have the wrong year on here. It should say 1898. So the USS Maine is docked there. On February 9th, the New York Journal is going to release the text of a letter that was written by a Spanish ambassador who was a Spanish ambassador to the United States. In the letter, he calls U.S. President McKinley weak and a bitter for admiration of the crowd. So he's saying that our president is weak and he's looking for the public to admire him. He's looking for, he's kind of like full of himself, is a good way to put it. So this would be a big insult at the time. And that's released to the newspapers. So this is kind of like the fuel to the fire of the start of the war. Shortly after this letter is released, the USS Maine, which is still at Havana Harbor, it explodes at night and sinks. And 260 of the 354 men on board are going to die. And this is all you're going to see in the newspapers after this, that there was a huge explosion. This particular newspaper said it was caused by a bomb or torpedo. So they're trying to insinuate that Spain bombed the USS Maine. So with the idea that the USS Maine has been bombed by the Spanish, Congress is going to authorize $50 million to prepare for combat. But President McKinley still refuses. And members of both political parties at the time are going to push for war. They're saying they insulted us, they blew up the USS Maine, they're a threat to us, we need to do something now. It turns out years later that the USS Maine actually had an internal issue and no one blew it up. There was no torpedo. It was an engine combustion issue that made it explode. So the Spanish actually didn't explode it, but we do go to war for it anyway. So on April 20th, Congress is going to declare Cuban independence, and the United States starts to blockade ports in Cuba. So we use our Navy to block anyone from leaving Cuba or coming into Cuba. The United States doesn't have to be the first one to declare war. Spain decides to declare war on April 24th. The United States is going to pass a war amendment called the Teller Amendment, which states the U.S. will not annex Cuba when the United States wins the war, and that we would give them independence. So we're not going to make them part of the United States. After Spain declares war on us, we call for 125,000 troops. It's a very short war. It only lasts 114 days. Before the war even starts in Cuba, the United States had been getting a war brewing in the Philippines. So before the war, the Secretary of Navy, Assistant Secretary of Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, he ordered Commodore George Dewey to go to the Philippines and engage with Spanish warships, just in case we had a war with Cuba. So he's doing this to prevent these Spanish warships from coming to Cuba to help support the war that's going to happen there. So United States, George Dewey is going to quickly take over the port at Manila in the Philippines. The United States is going to have a new leader put in charge, the leader of the Filipino nationalist movement, and they're going to declare the Filipino independence on June 12th, 1898. So the same time that the Spanish are fighting in Cuba, they're also fighting us in the Philippines with the help of the Filipinos. So the Spanish are going to surrender the Philippines to the United States in August 1898. So this really had nothing to do with Cuba, but the United States made it so that not only were they going to be successful in the Caribbean with Cuba, they made sure to push Spain out of the Philippines as well. And it's a new territory that we are going to have control of. Cuba, on the other hand, is the Cuban campaign is we're going to have over 1 million troops volunteer in the United States. The United States Navy is going to blockade Santiago in Cuba while we are preparing our troops to train and get ready for war. More than 17,000 troops are going to assemble right in Tampa, Florida, before they get sent off to go fight in the Spanish-American War. One group that's very famous from this war is called the Rough Riders. It's a special regiment that is made up of former Ivy League athletes, Irish policemen, ex-convicts, cowboys, Texas Rangers, several different Native American tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Pawnee, and the Creek Indians. And the individual who was in command of this, or second in command of this unit, was Theodore Roosevelt. So it was a rough group of guys from all different backgrounds, and that's how they got the nickname Rough Riders. The Rough Riders are going to be the most famous for being led by Roosevelt when they took charge of Kettle Hill during this war. This event would turn Theodore Roosevelt really into a legend. He was seen as not only a guy that was involved in politics, but also a guy that was willing to go fight and protect his country. So, like I mentioned, it was a very short war. By the time July came, the Spanish Navy is going to be trapped in Santiago, and they're going to try their best to attack the American fleet, but they're not successful. The Spanish are going to be destroyed with 474 killed in Santiago, and they're forced to surrender on July 17th in Cuba. And after that, American forces continue to take over land that was controlled by Spain On July 25th, American forces take Puerto Rico with very little resistance because the Spanish have given up at this point. So what started off was of just giving freedom to Cuba. The United States has successfully won Cuba, Puerto Rico, and we've taken over the Philippines. The treaty to end this war is called the Treaty of Paris, which takes place in the city of Paris, the meeting. That's how it got its name. The treaty is going to be signed December 10th, 1898, and this would give Cuba its independence. The United States was to annex Puerto Rico and Guam as new American territories. So we gained Puerto Rico and Guam from this war. We still have them now. The United States would continue to occupy Manila in the Philippines. When the war ended, there were 60,000 Spanish dead from wounds mostly and disease. 10,500 Cubans were killed. 5,462 Americans had died. Only 379 of this was in battle. Most of the Americans who died of disease during the war. In the Philippines, the United States is going to continue to have some issues that we need to sort out there. In January 1899, the Filipinos are going to declare their independence again, and they're going to name Emilio Agundalo president. And in February 1899, what's going to happen is a U.S. soldier is going to fire at these Filipino forces. And the forces, they were called the insurrectos. So 2 of these individuals are going to be killed. The U.S. Army commander is then going to order his troops to assault the insurrectors. And so this is going to start another war. So this is going to create the Philippine-American War. It's 1899 to 1902. It's not really ever focused on, but it is a war that we were involved in. The Philippine Republic declares war on the United States. More than 126,000 U.S. troops are going to be involved in this war. The United States spends $600 million on the war, and more than 4,000 Americans are going to be killed. However, the United States is going to be successful. The Filipinos are going to be forced to swear an alliance with the United States government, and the government is going to have control of the Philippines until after World War II.